Welcome everyone to Spirit Coffee Talk. Thank you so much for joining us. Today it's just myself and Elyse Catherine. We are some of the mediums and channelers at Avalon Spirit. And every weekend we get together, have some coffee or tea, and chat about the kind of current energies, really. We really end up following the current energies and the flow of the energies, whether it's astrological, whether it's um, things that are happening on the media stage or in our lives or energetically, like we're following the flows. And so, what's been really interesting that's been coming up is the concept of polarizing people. You know, people, whether it be on the political spectrum or within your family or friend group or in your community, even maybe if you're looking at people in history, polarizing people, people that trigger a sensation, a feeling within you, within a community, a collective, to essentially instigate change. However, that triggering or that polarization of who and what they are can really throw us for a loop. And sometimes we can get caught in the singular loop of it, of just the trigger feeling, versus being able to pull back and see how this sort of chaos and destruction is actually opening pathways to transformation. And so we're going to dive into that whole idea today and really unpack that because there's actually so much there for us to learn if we can get out of that kind of singular cycle of what the actual bleep, bleep, bleep. So that being said, welcome everyone. And yeah, how are you doing, Elyse?
I'm lively today. I was gonna put it out there. We were talking before. See what I mean? Oh my gosh.
After?
The universe or my brain at like 4:45 this morning after a late night last night was like, time to get up. And I was like, I don't really actually want to. And then it said, too bad. So I want to do my best today. Just being honest, I
Great.
said to Ginette, I'm like, I feel like my eyes are half closed and I feel like I'm trying to make them look awake, but they're just a little sleepy. So coffee is how I am
Coffee
this morning.
intake? Yes.
Yes. I so I guess on what you said, there's been, I mean, obviously, right? Like, call out the elephant in the room. There has been a lot of talk in the world, North America, and globally too, around this type of conversation. And so I think it's really it's in our faces right now, like big and bold. And I think we can talk about it from that larger stage of how these types of people that feel like such a stark contrast from what we wish to see in the world feels very disorienting. Like there's been a lot of people that I've talked to that are just like, I don't know what world I'm living in right now. I don't
Mhm.
like, and then there's some people that are like, yeah, I'm not surprised at all, actually, because I've seen a lot of this stuff playing out in my own intersection of life. And so, there's even that polarity. But I think whatever camp you're in, there's also these types of experiences can play out in our individual relationships, in our families, in like friendships and romantic relationships. People who we know or feel, a certain familiarity with can also then all of a sudden shift into this energy of polarity of like, I don't know this. Like, I
Mhm.
don't know what this is and how to be around this or how to engage with this or what to do with this. And I think to start, it's to say that, like, that's really disorienting for our systems and our own energy. And we talked, I can't remember, a few weeks back now, even about like when people are in different frequencies than us, how confronting and disorienting that can feel. So when we couple that just with like the current climate of things, it can feel really overwhelming. And like you said, we can get into this cycle of like, and kind of circle, which I don't always think is a bad thing to be in a cycle because we can have an awareness in that. But it's then at what point can I pause and step out of that to not let it cycle me down, but maybe cycle me up or find a different perspective within it.
Mhm. And I think that's the part where conscious choice has to come in really clearly, is like it's the process of recognizing how are you feeling with this situation or this person? Then what do you want to do about it, and what are your options of what you can do about it? Right? Like that's where consciousness comes into it instead of just like action reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Action reaction, we could say, would maybe be a very 3D way of dealing with something. Whereas conscious choice of exploring all the options within it, thinking critically, and then coming back to heart space of what feels most aligned with you, where do you hold your energy, would be more of like a 5D way of thinking. But
Mm-hmm.
I think the important thing is that these energetic changes we're going through right now, through the polarization we're seeing, are not I'm being shown the imagery, but they're not meant to be dealt with in a black or white way, a yes or a no way, because they're much bigger than that. And the polarizing is much bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the message I keep getting from spirit, is like this polarization, although I'm trying to stay very neutral here because I do definitely have my own opinions. But although to some people might seem very scary, others might seem very empowering,
Mm-hmm.
it is essentially both. Right. And it's kind of that thing of like two things can be right at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. It's not just right and wrong. And one thing that they were saying that's really neat about this polarization right now and this very chaotic time of change, and this will be easier to see if we kind of pull up from that higher spirit perspective versus just the human perspective. But they said from that higher perspective, what's really interesting is there is a change of consciousness happening through everybody on some level. And maybe I'll even say 90% of everybody, okay? On some level. And for some, it is very much the like just the very beginning. But what it's doing is it's kind of triggering their ego to start to validate that what they say matters. And
Mm-hmm.
in the very beginning, when the ego starts to be validated, people can become empowered. But then there's this point in which their empowerment can change into kind of following the heart or the head, following the light or the dark. Okay. And I'm not saying that the head is all dark, but when we're not living in the heart, we're not quite living in the light. Okay. If you follow me here. So what happens is this empowerment for different people in positions of power can start to fuel this energy and this capacity. But if they start to deviate to one side that, say, is more dark, they're still going to be able to create change and transformation, but it will likely come through more chaotic means versus somebody that chose to live in the heart would create similar changes and transformations in the long run, but through more passive, peaceful means. But what Spirit is getting at is that either way, the polarization that we're going through right now from that high perspective is creating the change that is needed. But there's just many pathways to that change.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does. Yeah.
Like when I say that and I hear it and I see it from that higher perspective, but when I'm trying to explain it, I'm also just hearing the human being
Mm-hmm.
like, but,
Mm-hmm.
and that's
Yeah.
even my own human being like, but what about this? But what about that?
Mm-hmm.
And spirit keeps saying, we're speaking from this level first. So you can
Mm-hmm.
only deal with this level first. And then we can come down and unpack each person's individual experience within that,
Mm-hmm.
which is really neat and also polarizing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Well, and yeah, it makes sense what you were saying. And I was having a similar response. Like I was like, yeah, I can feel that. I can see that. And my human self is also saying, but. And what was coming up for me is I think, especially right now, because we're seeing harm being done, right? And maybe that's not super neutral of me to say, but oh well. um, there's harm that people, and like, there's harm that's being done. And a lot, what's the word? The people who, when we're feeling this like response, I think a lot of times it's coming from that I don't want harm to be done through change. I don't want change to
Mhm.
have to come via harm being done.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that is fair. And it is something that, I myself sit with a lot. And Either way, though, if for you the response is, but there's harm being done, and I don't want to see that, and I don't want to let that happen, that's fair. And by staying in the spiral of the polarity, you won't actually make change, right? It's like a depletion of energy happens in that spiral. And I really notice that in myself when I'm consuming too much information. And I'm like, I want to be informed. I want to know what's going on. I don't want to have my head in the sand, which I think burying our head is a 3D reaction response of like, oh my God, I can't see it too much. And, or lashing out, or whatever it is. And I think there's a whole, conversation we could have even around like sacred rage and anger. And
Mm-hmm.
it has a play in all this like catalyzation too, and transformation. And getting stuck in that spiral of things where we're just like consuming, reacting, consuming, reacting, consuming, reacting. Da, da, da. I don't leave that feeling like, okay, I'm ready to make change. I leave
Right.
that being like, and my
Yeah.
brain going haywire and my nervous system having a really intense reaction because I'm like, what if this and but that and da, 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 da. And like, regard whatever the change you want to see, it doesn't come from a place of depletion. It comes from a place of empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
And by allowing ourselves to stay in this like this energy of being in the cycle or the spiral, due to someone's polarization or what they're saying or what they're doing or da, da, it's not going to have the impact that we want. And so it's like, again, it's this both and. It's observing. We have to be able to see the things that need to be changed in order to change them.
Mm-hmm.
And the process of that uncovering is rarely a nice one.
Yeah.
And we're in that. I'll often use the analogy of if you have mold in your house, you can't just be like, oh shit, I have mold. I'm going to paint over it, right? Like it's making me sick. It's, having all these impacts on me. Da, 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 da. It's poisoning me. But you have to get to the root of it and you have to clear it all out. Otherwise, it's just going to come back
Mm-hmm.
and make you sick all over again. And so it's like getting to the foundation and the root of these, moldy human issues that are really impacting our ability to grow and be conscious and be a collective community of, love and like the frequency of love, which we spoke about last week. It just like we have to get to the root of it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a shitty process and it's really hard and it's polarizing and it's like kind of just want to burn the house down.
Yeah.
But then you're really, really starting from a place that you don't necessarily need to.
I love that analogy you used of the mold, um, because that's so true. That literally happened to us. So we ended up having random mold because this pipe broke that we didn't know, and it was leaking to our entryway. And it was in the wall, so we didn't know until all of a sudden we're like, what is this smell? And then my husband dug into it, and then we're like, whoa, not good. And so it was chaotic and it was a little scary because we're like, oh my gosh, how long has this been here? And then we had to like tape everything off and it was kind of like an upheaval. But then we had the opportunity because we kind of had to, we were sort of forced into position where we then got to remodel our entryway and create this whole entire hockey locker for Easton's hockey
Mm,
stuff because before it was just laid out on the floor, which was annoying. And then we got to redo this closet piece, which was never big enough before. And so now we have this like really lovely, very effective and efficient entryway. And we would not have done it had the mold not happened. Right. And I know we're
mhm,
comparing mold to like geopolitical things or polarizing people, but that idea and that metaphor that you talked about, I think is so true because it
mm,
really is that. And I think that's that kind of higher level spirit's trying to explain is like, however you come about it, we could have redone our entryway before the mold happened, noticed the pipe, fixed it, and fine, no big deal. Or we had the mold happen and it caused a little panic and whatever, but the result ended up being the same, right? Does that mean there's not like energetic casualty along the way? I mean, that is the difference, right? And that's really important and significant. But that's where Spirit is saying, because of where the collective has gone, change is happening anyways, right? And so we can even see that if we bring it back to polarizing people in our lifetimes too. I think this really plays into when we're trying to like release shame or guilt or confusion over our judgments when we're growing up or making choices of things. And, you know, having polarizing relationships of people within your family, whether it's romantic relationships, and seeing not just the polarization, but what did that actually bring you in that whole experience? What did that bring you now in this point moving forward? Who are you now because of it? And sometimes they have to come through total chaos. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my tangent.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think of like, gosh, past relationships, past friendships where, you know, because I think to kind of go in a different direction, polarization and that chaos can also feel exciting. And I'm not talking about like the world stage here. I'm talking about like and maybe for some people, I don't know, but it's like that exciting new romance, but then there's a part of you that's like, I don't know, this is healthy, right? But it's got this like excitement to it. And oftentimes those are the relationships that can have a lot of hardship. There can be a lot of polarization, there can be a lot of challenges, and they can cause a lot of harm. And, when I think of some of those in my life, I'm like, gosh, but coming out of that, like I was such a different person than I was going into it. And in some ways, there was healing that I had to do coming out of that. But the fact that I came out of it and I saw my strength or my resilience or my ability to set boundaries with a person, or, I allowed certain things to like impact me that then all of a sudden I changed, and or they broke my heart or whatever, and then I made it through that. Like, we can, again, stepping out, find those ways in which we resolved, in which we, sought community, came together, supported one another, healed together on the other side of that coin. And it's not to say we ignore, the darkness of the hard side, but there is the silver lining that can be found. And this brings me to like a common phrase that we hear around, like everything happens for a reason. And I just don't like that phrase. But I think we can find purpose or meaning in everything, even if it's not something that was meant to happen. And we've, gone in past episodes about how complex the way life plays out is. And so, yeah, I think we can apply that same ideology to when we're experiencing these polarizing people, relationships, experiences, and really like calling it what it is, that they're hard. They're hard. Like, polarization is like those two ends of an extreme, bouncing back and forth or being in the middle of it or experiencing both at the same time. Like, that's a shock to the system. It's like you put a heat pad on your back and an ice pack on your chest. That doesn't feel good.
You're gonna throw up. Yeah,
Yeah, like
literally.
doesn't
Yeah,
feel good.
yeah. And one thing that spirit keeps showing me too is there, and it's really interesting because, yeah, fair. Okay, so what they're showing me is they're like, remember too that all of you that are here on this planet are here purposely at this time on a planet that is still steeped in density, and it is in its most massive transformation phase of consciousness, period. So it is going to be the most polarized time, the most extreme of dualities playing out. And they said that's because your souls were willing to be here during this very tumultuous time, not only for the collective advancement, but also for your own individual soul advancement. same as everybody else. And then you come in and there's free will choice that comes to everything that happens to you. And so they're like, just remember too that you're not, although some people might really feel this, and I get it, but we're not here on this planet being punished. We're here helping to try and transform it through individual relationships, through the growth that we have, through, every angle of it. Right. And so they're like, one thing we really have to shift ourselves out of is the victim mentality. We can still not agree with what's happening and not like it, and it can still piss you off. Right. And those are very fair. Like the rage you said, it's okay to have the rage and have something not be fair. But we can't sit in that spiral like you're talking about, which also leads into like victim mentality. And then we're not taking that kind of energetic and soul ownership for why we're here at this point. Right. And they're like, it's really important that we all root into that to help us find or sustain our purpose through these transformative times in this polarization. Because they're like, planet Earth is polarized. Planet Earth has huge and really deep dualities. And that's part of its transformation. So I think it's a really good point. It's a good point to remember. And it's hard to remember when we're feeling really triggered.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious, what do you do to pull yourself out of that, or to shift out of that space when you're noticing you're caught?
For me, I find because I've had, several experiences with polarity now, I can pull from those experiences to say, listen, all of these things are cycles of, highs and lows, and things happen. And I've survived all of the other ones. And I will continue to survive this one. So what do I consciously want to do about it now? Right? Like that's what I've really started to be able to dive into now, is like, what can I control in this moment? What do I want? Where's my gratitude? I often think, what could be worse right now at this point? Okay, well, this could be worse. And it helps, that to me really helps reset my mind to keep moving forward, because the whole purpose is to move forward. That's the whole thing. We need to move forward. And so I find that's what I do. Like I try to reflect back and then consciously choose. That is easier now because I've had several experiences though, right? So if people are really new into these experiences of polarity in their life on the political spectrum, however they see it, it's very daunting when you don't have something to pull from yet. And so in that case, I would suggest people read people's stories, right? Like people's biographies of their journeys through life, highs and lows, to empower them with knowledge of how people can move through things. I think that's what works for me. But what about you?
Yeah, that reminds me of the book. It's a intense read, but Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh,
Have you read that book?
no, I haven't read it.
Oh my gosh, and I'm totally spacing on his name. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he was a psychologist or psychiatrist. Now I'm doing
Oh,
a
I
terrible
think I
job
have.
of
I think I have
Search for Meaning.
actually.
What's his name? What's his
Yeah,
name? Come on,
I'm
Ray.
gonna look it up right now.
As soon as you say it, I'm gonna be like, duh. But speaking to, he documents his own
Oh yeah, Viktor
experience.
Frankl.
Viktor Frankl, duh.
Yeah.
I can see the picture at the front of the book. I'm pretty sure it's on that bookshelf back there. But he documents his own experience, but then he also documents his experience of how he saw people, like the things that he saw people do to survive, and much of it being their own headspace and holding out hope and looking for the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, and kind of keeping the focus on that. It's much deeper than that, and it's a really, I think, important read for everyone, so would recommend. And so yeah, that was coming up when you were speaking. But I think for me, I really, when I kind of feel that stuck in that churn, I feel it really viscerally in my body. And oftentimes it'll manifest kind of how my hair is
No, right? Me too.
driving me crazy. It manifests for me very viscerally, and it, like, I have to move it. It feels almost like anxiety. I can tell it's not an anxiety, but it's like the somatic sensations of anxiety, and it's kind of this intensity in my body. And so usually that means I have to like step away from whatever is creating that churn as best I can. Sometimes it's moving my body, sometimes it's just like journaling it out, sometimes it's like talking to myself in the car, or trying to get it out of my brain and out of my body in some way, because I find when it stays internal, that's where like the spiral can just continue, and all of a sudden my brain's like, well, and what about this, and da, 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 da. So I have to really be aware of that and be like, nope, we're not going to do that. We're going to step out of it, move it some way. And then, similar to what you were saying, it's like, is there something in this churn, once I'm kind of out of it and I can take a look at it, is there something that I need to do? Is there something that I need to do for myself, for my, my circle, my community? Is there something that needs to be said or done? How can I then re-engage with it if necessary? Because sometimes that's necessary, sometimes it's not. If it is necessary to re-engage with it, how can I do that from a way of standing in my power, and not, as best I can, allowing myself to get kind of sucked back into that cycle. Sometimes that happens, and then it's a repeat process, and sometimes it's a longer process. Sometimes we are in the churn for a couple days, or a longer period of time, and then other times it's quick, oh shoot, this is happening, and I can step out of it. So it's very dependent on the situation and your experience with it. But for me, yeah, it's having that awareness, doing something to pull my energy out of it, usually something physical, and then re-engaging with it at some point once I feel resourced too. It's not necessarily just jumping right back into it. Sometimes it's like I need to take a little bit of time and space around it. And I've really noticed that in the last few weeks, the energy overall, I've needed more space before re-engaging to like hold my energy and my boundaries in it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's giving yourself that space. It's a really good point. I also find too, when somebody triggers me or something triggers me, I really make a point now to actually stop and sit and be like, what about this is really bothering me? Like the ones that you're not like, I mean, things can trigger us and we're like, oh, that's awful, or I don't agree. And then we kind of move on with life and we sort of forget about it. It doesn't follow us. But the ones that like follow, you know, those ones I'll sit and I'll be like, what about this is triggering for me? And sometimes when I actually give myself the space to go deeper, I was like, what does it actually mean for me? Sometimes I'll find that I'm like, oh, I just really don't agree with it. And I think it's very unfair. I'm like, okay, that's a fair point. I can't do anything about it to that specific thing right now, but I get it. And then I can start to kind of like let it go. Because I'm like, I found the root, I guess. Other times it might be a trigger where I'm like, oh, hey, look, that's something I need to work on, right? Like that's really triggering me and I don't know what to do about that. And so that's why I think too, when we take the energetics of what are happening behind the polarization, is like, it's also giving you the opportunity to dive into different aspects of you, of your beliefs. Maybe it's asking you, what do you actually think about this situation? Right? Because I know sometimes with polarization, I can almost be stuck because I can see both sides. Not that I even agree with both sides, but I can see where that side is coming from and what brought them to that. And I can see what that side is coming from and what brought them to that. And then I have to sit and think, I'm like, okay, but what do I actually think about this? Because sometimes I get stuck in understanding where they're both coming from. I'm like, yeah. But I'm not taking my own opinion on that. So sometimes in the polarization, I also try and stop and say, like, what do I think about it? Like truly. And I find that to be helpful sometimes too.
Yeah. Yeah, because the reality is every person's perspective is their perspective. And we can look at it and be like, no, how? Absolutely not. But they're like, we might not we might not have the full picture of their perspective, or we might not understand fully what's informing that perspective, but it is their perspective. And I might, with my full heart and chest, disagree with it or have an opposite perspective. But without understanding the why, it becomes really hard to shift that, right? Like Maddie in the background. Oh, I get her. Oh, she's like, oh, pardon me.
Like, oops, sorry. Sorry,
Excuse
everyone.
me. Excuse me. Comedic relief by Maddie. Yeah, like when we can step back, like you said, and hear broader perspectives. I've learned a lot through that. Doesn't off Not often, doesn't always change my perspective, but I've learned a lot through being able to step back and hear both. And then you're right, as a Libra, I can sometimes be like, huh? Oh yeah, huh? Oh yeah. Not always. It's very dependent on the situation, but especially in situations where I don't necessarily have a ton of knowledge or information, or like I'm
Yeah.
still learning, or it's not something that's like a values based thing or like something that's really sturdy within me. I'm kind of like, I don't know. And then people present both sides. I'm like, yeah. Both, both.
Yeah.
But that's also why my saying, one of my favorite sayings is two things can be true at once. And you mentioned that, right? Like two things can be true. And we're all engaging in this reality through our own eyes, our own perspective, our own spirit, our own life experiences, our own intersectionality. So it just, yeah, what we think is like one linear polarized thing is actually just like infinite
Totally.
polarized potentials.
Yeah. And I think as we're raising our consciousness, that's what we're starting to recognize, like as a collective, is how infinite everything is. Even in, I mean, we can tangent down so many things, but like truly, it's just infinite in everything. Every decision at any given moment is changing the trajectory of something, right? So it's just something interesting. So I think to bring this all back kind of around again is like one of the ways in navigating this polarization, I think, is really remembering that you're here for a reason. Like you're experiencing this for a sole reason. Your human might not understand it, and that's fair. And I have had moments where my human did not understand why I was going through what I'm going through, right? But the soul knows. And I think taking time to pull back from that higher perspective to kind of recalibrate is really important. And I also think asking yourself, what do you think, or what is coming up for you individually in the experience you're having? And what does that mean? Is helping you to get to know you better. And I think the more we know ourselves, the more power we carry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
No, I don't think so. I think, no, I don't think so. Actually, yes. Um, I I think if anything that we said today felt polarizing for you,
Mm-hmm.
sit with that. I know, like, even things that we both said internally, I was like, huh, like
Yeah,
right
me
when
too.
we were first talking,
Yeah,
and Spirit brought some of that through. I was like, huh, and the yeah buts.
yeah,
That's fair and valid, and nothing that we say here we propose to be the 100% truth, right? This is gray. This is everything is gray. I believe everything is gray, and yeah, so it's like honoring what feels true for you, and if there's things that are triggering here or in the world or in life, allowing yourself the space to sit with it, and also, like really acknowledging that everyone's tired. Some people more than others, and there's a lot happening, and there's a lot changing, and like that it's a lot. And so yeah, just honoring if you're feeling like the weight of that and the fatigue of that, and that this is a marathon, not a sprint. So, tend to yourself as best you can.
absolutely. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. And hopefully this gives you some things to ponder to help you define you better and feel more purposeful in why you're here at this time. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you all next week.